It was the summer of 2015 when I first heard about the legend of the night drifter. At first, I thought it was just another urban myth, one of those small-town horror stories meant to keep kids from sneaking out at night. But as I would soon learn, some legends are born from truth, and the truth is far more terrifying than any fiction. I was visiting my cousin Mark in a small town in West Virginia, a place so quiet that even the wind seemed to whisper through the empty streets. Mark and I had grown up together but drifted apart after high school. He had moved to this secluded town for work, and I decided to stay with him for a couple of weeks during the summer break. The first few nights were uneventful. We drank beer on his porch, swapped old stories, and watched as the town slipped into an eerie silence after sunset. But on the third night, everything changed. It started with a knock at the door, a slow, deliberate knock, 3 times. Mark and I exchanged glances. It was already past midnight, and no one ever visited this late. Mark hesitated before walking to the door. I followed behind him, an uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. He peeked through the peephole and immediately stepped back, his face turning pale. "What is it?" I whispered. He didn't answer, just shook his head and gestured for me to stay quiet. The knocking resumed. 3 slow, heavy knocks. Curious and nervous, I decided to take a look myself. I pressed my eye to the peephole and felt my stomach drop. A man stood outside, but something about him was off. Waiting. Mark grabbed my arm and pulled me away from the door. "Don't open it," he muttered. I didn't plan to. After what felt like an eternity, the knocking stopped. We waited, listening. When we finally gathered the courage to look outside again, the man was gone. But that was just the beginning. The next day, Mark seemed on edge. I asked him about the man, but he refused to talk about it. "He always comes back," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I frowned. "What do you mean, always?" Mark sighed and rubbed his temples. "That thing, that man, he's been showing up at my door for the past 2 weeks, always at the same time, always knocking 3 times. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Who is he?" Mark shook his head. "No one knows, but I've heard stories. People say he only appears at night, and if you open the door for him, you'll disappear." I wanted to believe it was just some crazy town rumor, but the fear in Mark's eyes told me otherwise. That night we stayed up, waiting. At exactly 12:15 a.m., the knocking started again. 3 slow, heavy knocks. This time, we were ready. Mark had set up a small camera near the front window aimed at the porch. We sat in the living room watching the feed on his laptop, and then we saw him. A strange static-like sound crackled through the speakers of Mark's laptop. Then, something horrifying happened. The man moved. But he didn't walk, he glided. 1 second he was at the door, the next he was standing by the window staring directly at the camera, and then the screen went black. The moment the screen cut out, we heard something inside the house. A creak, a soft, deliberate creak, as if someone was stepping onto the wooden floor. We weren't alone anymore. Mark grabbed a baseball bat, his hands trembling. I reached for my phone, but my fingers were shaking too much to dial. The air grew heavy, thick with something unseen but suffocating. Then we heard the whisper. It was faint, almost like the wind, but unmistakable. "Open the door." I turned my head slowly. The front door was still locked. The windows were shut, but the voice was inside the house. A shadow moved in the hallway, a tall, lanky figure half hidden in the darkness. My breath caught in my throat. Mark swung the bat. The figure vanished. For hours, we stayed huddled in the living room, too afraid to move. The knocking never came again, but we knew. We knew it was still there, watching. The next morning, Mark packed his bags. He had lived in that house for over a year, but after that night, he refused to stay another minute. I didn't blame him. Before we left, I checked the camera footage again. The file was corrupted, but one frame remained. It showed the tall figure standing directly in front of the camera, But this time his face was visible, and it looked exactly like Mark. We never spoke about that night again. Mark moved to another state and I returned home. But sometimes in the dead of night I hear it. 3 slow, heavy knocks. And I know he's still out there, waiting. Even after moving back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. The first time I heard the knocking again was 3 weeks later. I was alone in my apartment watching TV late at night when the sound echoed through the silence. 3 slow, heavy knocks. I froze. I lived on the 3rd floor. There was no way someone could be knocking at my window. Dread filled my chest as I turned my head, my breath hitching. And then I saw it. A shadow. Not outside. Inside. Standing in the corner of my living room, barely visible in the dim light. Tall. Unnaturally tall. Its head tilted to the side, watching me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then, in the same voice I had heard that night, it whispered, "You should have opened the door." The lights flickered, and the room went black, and when they came back on, I was alone again. But I knew, deep in my bones, that it wasn't over. Not yet. Because the knocking never stops, and once you hear it, it never truly leaves.